Hello, and welcome to this episode of the COP26 Conversation podcast, part of the Climate Crisis Thinking Network, hosted by the Oxford Research Centre in the Humanities. My name is Dr. Giulia Champion, and I'm a lecturer in the Interdisciplinary Studies Centre at the University of Essex, and a research assistant in the Centre for Interdisciplinary Methodologies at the University of Warwick. Today I'm joined by 5 brilliant researchers and practitioners who will discuss with me their work in relation to climate change, narratives, and coastal communities. So we'll begin by having my colleagues introduce themselves. We'll then discuss the context of COP26 and develop the conversation from there, thinking about narration, narrativity, and lessons from the coast and the ocean.
My name is Dr. Liz Morris-Webb, and I'm currently an interdisciplinary postdoctoral researcher at Bangor University in Wales. I can be found in, on, or around the sea 99% of the time. First 17 years of my career was as a marine ecologist, but increasingly involved understanding the human dimensions of the marine environment. So I pursued a PhD more as a human ecologist than as a marine ecologist, often drawing on environmental psychology and human geography. I now work with people living, working, and playing around our coasts to research their interactions with the environment and how this affects their behaviour, their sense of place and community. My main research is on a project called EcoStructure that encourages climate change adaptation through ecologically sensitive infrastructure on the Irish Sea coasts. I also have research interests in coastal resource collection in Wales and in Brazil. All of the participants in my work are part of coastal communities being affected by the changing climate, from changing food and livelihoods to changing cultures and places. I believe the key to building resilience in our rapidly changing world is through understanding the people as much as the environment, and to nurture a more sustainable practice through communication. Telling the stories of coastal communities in their own words is an increasingly important part of my work, and why I'm here today to join this conversation. Thank you for the invitation, Giulia.
My name is Abigail Allan, and I'm currently studying for an MPhil in classical archaeology at the University of Oxford after completing my BA here in classical archaeology and ancient history. Although I study archaeology, I consider myself to be a sort of broader heritage professional, having worked in a variety of museums and heritage settings. Most importantly to today's conversation, I was the lead researcher and writer for National Historic Ships UK's Climate Change Report. National Historic Ships is funded by DCMS, which is the Department for Culture, Media and Sport in the UK, and acts as an advisory body for people or organisations who manage historic working ships, museum ships, and other kinds of maritime heritage. The report was about the impacts of climate change on that heritage, with a focus on historic ships and the ways in which the sector can act to mitigate and adapt to climate change. I've also previously written on climate change issues, including climate change and the working class, and climate change and endangered archaeology for Anthroposphere, which is the Oxford Climate Review. I'm now currently researching the recent and potential impact of climate change on maritime archaeology in specific localized settings on the Egyptian coast of the Red Sea, using satellite mapping as a key tool, which enables me to do my research remotely from Oxford.
Hi, my name is Anna Woodhead, and I'm an environmental social scientist at the University of York in the UK. A lot of my past work and research has focused on how different types of change impact on coastal communities, and this includes climate change. I've been lucky enough to work with people off the coast of Cornwall and Wales and the Seychelles, where different communities have shared their stories of change with me, and I'm very excited to discuss this with all of you today.
Hello, my name is Karl Dudman, and I'm a PhD student at the University of Oxford's Institute for Science, Innovation and Society. Right now, I'm conducting fieldwork at the North Carolina State Climate Office, where I'm based as a visiting Fulbright scholar. My research focuses on parts of the state that are at increasing risk from sea level rise, but where the climate change narrative itself is not widely embraced. And I'm exploring how coastal flooding gets governed in those contexts, and what capacity the UN framework has to give such communities representation in a forum like COP. Outside of academia, I'm also a photographer and a writer. I was previously head editor for the Oxford Climate Review, and I've served as a youth delegate for the Seychelles at COP24. I've also worked in climate change communication for the organisation Climate Outreach.
My name is Holly Cronin. I'm a PhD student in human geography at McGill University in Canada and a fellow at the Smithsonian Tropical Research Institute in Panama. Broadly speaking, I study how people are creating livelihood opportunities in coastal areas and what sustainability means in those contexts. My research investigates emerging seaweed aquaculture industries with a focus on understanding novel ways of operating and organizing. The perspective I bring to this conversation has been shaped by a long-standing interest in the stories of fishing communities, and I am incredibly fortunate to have lived and conducted fieldwork in several communities on Canada's Atlantic coast, in the US, and in Central America over the past dozen years. Those experiences have instilled a deep appreciation for the perspectives of people who work on the water, as well as for the complex challenges of navigating the marine policy space. And I am really delighted to be joining all of you for today's conversation.
We aim to ask what stories about climate change are or aren't told in the elitist context of COP26. What stories are told on the coast or about the coast in the context of climate crisis? And what lesson can we learn from coastal spaces, coastal communities, and from the ocean? Before we begin, I would like to say that we don't aim to speak for coastal communities around the world, and we understand our own position of elitism in the Euro-North American space of academia. We hope to carve a space for voices that aren't being heard, but do not presume to speak for them. We also recognize the complicity of the spaces and frameworks within which we work, and within which podcast is created. Complicity with colonial and neo-imperial practices, and we are aware of this legacy's entanglement with our current climate emergency. In the future, with more time and funding, we would hope to create a space in which we can directly feature coastal voices. We have decided to focus on the topics of articulation, narration, and storytelling, also to foreground the importance of the humanities and social sciences methods and practices to tackle our current crisis. While those sciences permit us to confirm human impact on our world, evidenced by the IPCC 6 assessment report published on 6 August 2021, scientific research alone cannot resolve our crisis. An interdisciplinary approach encompassing the social sciences and humanities is crucial to fully grasp anthropogenic impact and understanding possible attitudinal and cultural shifts toward fostering more sustainable practices.
So change on coastlines is really inevitable, especially in the face of climate change. Like, they're already really dynamic areas, as we know, and then climate change is just going to make them even more dynamic and predictable and affect the rate of changes that happen naturally. So in terms of coastal heritage and archaeology, one case study I find really interesting concerning this is that of Siraf in Iran, which is on the Persian Gulf, where a case study has recently been undertaken to track the erosion of at-risk coastal archaeology there. So archaeological heritage at Siraf exists from the Sassanid period of 224 to 652 AD onwards, so that's in the modern era, through the Islamic periods and into much more recent history. The case study focused in particular on a section of the coast split into 244 transects and then grouped into 4 larger subgroups. And the people doing this case study observed coastline change there from 1980 to around 2010 via satellite imagery, which is how I came across the case study because that's one of my current research interests. So what was really interesting about this case study is the way that new human coastal architecture built in Zone 3. So some seawalls were built in order to create a kind of coastal resort in 2008, had affected longshore sediment transport to other littoral cells along the Surf coastline. But meanwhile, in Zone 4, construction of a fishing harbour acted as a downdrift sediment trap, blocking sediment transfer into that zone. Oh, and also all of these effects were compounded by continued drought since the early 2000s, which had severely affected sediment supply to coastal areas. So I think this case study shows how even with human input to try to stabilize coasts, as in the case of Siraf sea walls, we ultimately can't control such dynamic places, especially with the dynamism of coasts being compounded by anthropogenic climate change. So I don't know enough about this case study to be able to say what had caused the drought, but certainly droughts are listed among the IPCC's sort of impacts of climate change going forwards. So everything we do has this sort of knock-on effect, which impacts both livelihoods and heritage. As someone from a working class background who's previously written about the working class's impact or often lack of relative impact on climate change, one of the things I was really struck about with COP was the conversations happening on Twitter amongst my peers about their physical access to COP26. So I've seen a lot of stories of people hiking the prices of their Airbnbs for the 2 weeks of COP, as well as the city's policy of making public transport free for the next 2 weeks. And I just really believe that free, or at least very cheap, subsidised public transport is something that should already exist across the UK anyway. And trying to get to Glasgow now and being working class is pretty much impossible. But actually, it already kind of was. So it's actually cheaper to fly via another country than to get a train to Glasgow, which I just think is quite insane.
Looking back over the course of the COP dialogues, the question of access was one that was extremely prominent throughout, both, as you say, physically, Abby, just from the pure logistics of getting it was a huge COP, and, you know, with COVID and, you know, just the usual logistics of getting representatives of the whole world into one space, access is always a big conversation. And I think, you know, for a COP that was pitting itself as being the most inclusive ever, it seems that a lot of people seem to agree that it was perhaps one of the most exclusionary ever. So this question of who gets representation is not just a physical and logistical question of who can get inside the right rooms, but then ultimately who gets to be involved in the end result and who gets to have a say. So I think a conversation like this one, where we're thinking about these broader issues of inclusion and which narratives and which voices end up in the final product, are even more pertinent now than ever, because it's a point that people in social sciences and humanities have been making ad nauseum, that you know, from the science to the politics of global climate politics, it's always a struggle to open the doors for greater inclusivity, and that hasn't gone away at this COP, it seems.
I think ethically it's a challenging one, isn't it, of who goes to COP? I mean, so many people might think it's not the right thing to do to go to COP because of the climate crisis. So whether or not it's free or accessible is a really tricky question. So like you say, as academics and scientists and people representing our respondents and stakeholders, it's part of our job to make sure, I feel that it's part of our job to make sure that we represent the people that we are talking about and with fairly. But like you say, getting the right voices out there and the powerful stories, it just takes a few powerful stories. If you look at the case of Xiao Shuri, I think that's how you pronounce her name, the Amazonian 24-year-old from the Amazon. There can't have been many people from her indigenous area who made it to COP, but the story she told was so powerful. I hope it made a difference, and it's a really lovely one to listen to find an indigenous voice at COP.
Yes, I mean, I have a tendency to agree with that. I think it's really true. And to me, what was the most shocking was the fact that in the COP26 meeting, there were basically 503 people, check the numbers, with links to the fossil fuel industry to participate in the talks, which, and as you're saying, it is likely, and it is for sure, that a lot of different indigenous community either didn't make it or didn't have a space, whether for financial reasons, practical ones, etc. So it is really this idea of representation to me that shows how, to some extent, how this discourse is exclusionary on top of what, you know, you're all mentioning. So while numbers are problematic, what is really exciting, as you say, Liz, is the fact that maybe if one story makes it out, then this is how we can potentially have powerful change. So this idea of storytelling in particular, I'm very interested about, partially because I've been formed as a literary scholar or a cultural studies scholar, so I'm very interested in the different stories. But I think in a time of environmental crisis, the way we tell a story can allow us to think about all these different ideas and how to act, and it can shape the way people can potentially empathize with communities who don't have a space.
So actually on that point, I was thinking, in addition to just hearing those stories, being inspired by them, I think there is also just so much knowledge in both Indigenous and non-Indigenous coastal communities that really we all can learn from at this point in history. I think that there's just so much coastal communities can teach us in terms of mindset. Right now, as a global society, we're living in this moment where we all recognize that these changes are happening, and coastlines are very, very dynamic places, which I think we'll get into later in this conversation. But people who've lived in those areas really have adapted incredibly well to many, many changes over the course of history. And I think there are a lot of lessons there. I think also in terms of their intimate knowledge of the sea and how humans can interact with it in ways that are both sustainable and unsustainable, there's a lot there for us to learn as well. And then in terms of another voice that I did see represented in some of the conversations at COP, but also I think we could always use more of, is to really think about the voice of nature in these conversations, and what it is that we can learn from the environment as well.
I wanted to make a really quick point about that, as whilst we're still talking about COP, is just that it's really interesting to see how the geography of the COP negotiations is organized and carved up according to what kinds of conversations are taking place. So, you know, from over here in North Carolina, I was actually supposed to go to COP. I decided in the end that it wasn't worth the carbon that I would consume to get myself there, just for the sake of my research. But so I followed along with the side events and various other things happening, and you know, you have those conversations taking place, people sharing their insight, certain kinds of expertise, as you say, Holly, that are so invaluable to our ability to respond to the emerging crisis, but they're always relegated to certain spaces and areas which are not actually the central, you know, the halls of power where the technical aspects are actually being negotiated. And you know, I always think it's so funny how there's a kind of a specifically marked area within, I guess it's in the green zone somewhere, where protest is allowed to happen, and it's kind of sanctioned by the COP process. And then there's the unofficial protests outside of the whole complex as well. So there's these different layers of permission and access according to what kind of contribution you want to make, how subversive it is. And you know, it's certainly true that COP is more than just the dialogue between governments and the kind of text that emerges at the end. It is also a society-wide deliberation and a chance for certain ideas and concepts to be shared, so that we can all, you know, learn in our collective, you know, efforts to address climate change. But it's very, very much organized in a kind of hierarchical space, very physically within COP. So, you know, as to whether those kinds of expertise that you're talking about, Holly, and that we're all talking about in this conversation, make it into the places where, you know, powerful choices are being made, that's a big question mark.
I think, drawing on what Giulia and Karl said, I didn't attend COP, so I can't visualize how it was working. But like Giulia said, there's 500 petrochemical people turning up, and I don't know, say 50 people in climate change hotspots fighting for their coast today. And I wonder how fair the representation was across the board. Were they given spaces so that, you know, proportionally people had space? So like Giulia said, proportionally there's more people on the coast impacted by climate change than there are a number of companies in petrochemicals, although obviously they are essential in their own way. But I just wonder, does anyone know what kind of spatial representation people had there? The actual people from around the coast in the world? impacted by climate change? No. That would be
If
interesting.
only it was that well thought out and that
Well,
representative.
an interesting one for future, because like you say, getting the voices to the right places and the right halls of power it would be a different approach for future.
To mention as well that, of course, when we're talking about coastlines and, obviously countries all around the world have a coast, the UK being one of them and a prominent, island nation. But if we think about the kinds of issues that come with being coastal, obviously islands are the ones who will probably often have some of the worst impacts as a result of a changing climate. And it is the island nations, particularly in the Pacific and the Caribbean, who are often have the most to lose from sea level rise, and also have the furthest to come to something like COP26 or any of these generally pretty Eurocentric conferences. Before my PhD, I was doing some support work for the Seychelles delegation at COP, and so sitting in on a lot of the discussions between the participating countries of AOSIS, the Alliance of Small Island States, and as a bloc, they're all trying to figure out how to coordinate their message and their demands in order to have anywhere near as much clout as a country like the US, who can just kind of put their foot down and say what they want. Whereas this is, dozens of countries whose relationship with climate change is about as existential as it gets. But, in terms of this conversation about representation, it perhaps matters for no one in the world more than low-lying island states, and yet the challenges of getting to actually be there, of traveling across the world, and then in this case getting access to vaccines, and it's hugely important, and yet it's so unequal every time. It's like that much more of a challenge for a lot of coastal communities to actually be there and have their voices heard.
I wanted to follow up too on the concept of representation, because there are many different ways that can play out, and two that I've been thinking about a lot recently are the idea of someone or several people's voices being heard, which we've been talking about, but the other is also ultimate reflection and policy outcomes. Are those voices being represented in the decisions that are made and the policies that affect these people often more than anyone else in the world? And it just made me think a bit. So one of the great privileges of having sustained engagement with specific coastal communities over time is being able to have a bit of a sense of how people's perspective changes over time, and even just looking at very local levels in small community conversations around policies that impact fishing in a specific area, and just hearing people feel really empowered to go to those fishing meetings, go to those events, and really have something to say. And then over time, when very strong and well-informed points that those people have made are not at all reflected in policies, and they see things coming back to them where they're sort of oftentimes forced to fish in ways that they don't believe are sustainable, but they have no other option because they need to make a living, and sort of seeing this sense of resignation come over people, and the idea of like, well, what's the point of showing up for meetings anymore? And to me, that is really where, that's where I start to worry even more so than when we're looking at stock assessments in these places. And, I, as someone who also was not able to attend COP, I have been following more conversations around that, fellow academics, people who are on the coast, some of the popular press around that. And one of the things that I have noticed too is that there seems to be, I've heard more about this meeting from everyday people than who I imagined 3 years ago didn't even know that COP meetings were happening, right? So I think that just this awareness and some of the conversations for the discourse around that meeting does give me some hope that perhaps tides are turning more towards like empowered activism at the grassroots level. And I think it'll be interesting to watch how that plays out over the coming year as well.
I think sort of segueing maybe to like our idea of stories around the coast as well, because I think I did attend the protest in Glasgow on the Saturday, which was like, I think the biggest protest Glasgow had ever seen. And what really stood out for me actually was the cacophony of different stories of like different people for different reasons. And actually, we were having quite a long discussion because the march got delayed by about 3 hours. So there was a lot of time to talk, and just realizing that on many levels, our block, which was the biodiversity block, maybe didn't necessarily agree with a lot of the other points that the other blocks were making, but that we all had this sort of like, we were all centrally concerned about climate change and the inaction, but all of our values and motivations and everything connected to that was sort of really diverse. And so I think I just wanted to say, like, I agree, it's really interesting talking about representation in COP and what turns into policy, but also maybe seeing the value in that diversity. And I don't actually know how one would deal with that as in policy making, but it's just sort of my feeling from being on the ground there. What stood out for me was the loudness, but also the, like, as I say, cacophony of voices. It's also interesting how stories like visually came through. And I think for me, the Simon Coffey's address from knee deep in the sea was a really powerful image, that actually stories don't have to just be spoken, they can be visual. And I think that was a really interesting, I'd never thought about it before talking to so many humanities scholars, I think, as well as attending the protest itself.
I definitely agree with you there, Anna. But since working more with humanities researchers, the visualization of people's stories is so powerful, and it does make me wonder. In policy, particularly, it's been so backed historically by scientific data on biodiversity or climate change that those stories have been not heard until recently. And going back to something that Holly was talking about, that stakeholders seem to get so frustrated, I think, that their voices haven't been heard, that they've almost given up. And now we face the challenge of how to re-engage those people so that they do want their voices heard. And I've been working a lot with Brazilian researchers who have seemed to be leading the way, where Britain is much less so, all about visualizing people's stories and actually getting their voices heard by policymakers and decision makers. And I think in the UK, you know, we are an island nation. I think we're the 12th longest coastline in the world. We've got villages that are going to be lost in the next 30 years. We've got place, I heard in the news last week, a place in Pembrokeshire who their main access road will be cut off within a few years, and the funding's been cut to rebuild the road or redirect the road. And are there stories out there? It's reassuring to hear that you could visualize that when you went to the march, Anna.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with all these points. And I think what really struck me when we think about the frustration you all discuss along with the visualization was that the address by Simon Coffey reminded me of a poem that was collaboratively written and performed by a poet, activist, and scholar from the Marshallese Island called Kathy Jitnil-Kajiner, and a Greenlandic sort of poet and activist called Akaniviana. And the poem is entitled Rise from One Island to Another. But what's really interesting is that actually in COP21, so 6 years ago and 5 COPs ago, Kathy Jitnil-Kajiner was there. She was doing a lot of activism, a lot of sharing, talking about the situation in the Marshall Islands. So seeing today, or a couple days ago, Coffey's address in the water, it really struck me how it was similar to that poem that was basically a collaboration that came out of the frustration in COP21. So the fact that these people from Pacific Island in that context, but here also Greenland, if we think about Akaniviana, which obviously are worries about cryospheric melt versus hydrospheric rise, but they are obviously connected, right? So the poem itself, Rise from an Island to Another, is extremely powerful, I think. And really shows visually in the way language through poetry can translate this frustration. And it is also a cry for mobilization. So there's quite an interesting play on the rise. It's not just that water is rising, but also people are invited to rise against the fact that the impact is created by certain groups, but the consequence is received by other groups. There's a clear unevenness there that we've been talking about. So the fact that 5 years after, this first activism by somebody from the Marshall Islands, we're still in 6 years, we're still in a similar situation, really shows how stagnant things have been, I think. And I'm quite surprised when I share this poem, how often people haven't heard of it when it's such a powerful piece. Some of you had, so, it's there. But what is fascinating is that it's extremely powerful, and it really also tells us very straightforward thing. It's not a poem that is trying to use very subtle metaphor. It's straightforward because the message is so crucial and important, and which doesn't take away from the beautiful poetry it is, and the way the performance weaves together sort of visual cues, poetry and music, shows the collaboration of all these fields in creating a message that really is supposed to get to your gut. So yeah, I think visual arts can not only help us think about this cacophony, as you were talking about, in these multiple voices, but by standing the test of time, they also show us how things are not changing.
Perhaps you could also tell us, Giulia, about that project that I think we talked very briefly about in our first conversation. I had encountered them before because of their work on the funeral for the glacier, but the thing about the sister cities parallel thing, I thought that was super interesting, and maybe others would like to hear about it as well.
Yes, I love this. So it's through anthropologists from Rice University in Texas, and they've been working on a lot of different projects. One of them is Funeral for Glaciers in Iceland, which is a very powerful way to consider what it means to lose ice there, and potentially by making them human and giving them a funeral. There's a practice in mourning, but a practice in realization as well that can be translated across. But a new project they're starting recently in the past couple of years, and they've talked about it in conferences, but also one of them has published a blog post / article on it. So it's Simone Howe and Dominic Boyer. By looking at NASA data, they've realized that cryospheric melt from Reykjavik, Iceland, most impacts Cape Town in South Africa. And obviously it's usually surprising because you might not even know that you can follow the ice like that. But I think what's fascinating is that they're trying to create a project on hydrological globalization that uses the urban concept of sister cities. By following these, sort of Reykjavik and Cape Town are not easily comparable in terms maybe of historical development or shared colonial past or non-colonial past, language, etc. But that change that is so intimately tied with anthropogenic climate change makes them sister city. So I think I really love this idea of hydrological globalization because it allows us to see in a very straightforward way the kind of impact the climate crisis is having and the way it's connecting us so much more. And I guess it talks to other ideas on terms of the local versus the global that some of you I know are working on.
So thinking about ideological globalization is super interesting, but I think it's also really important to consider how thinking globally in other contexts doesn't work quite so well. So as a classical archaeologist, I'm currently studying the maritime archaeology of the Mediterranean and MENA region and trying to look at recent, current and potential future climate change patterns on the eastern coast of Egypt, in particular focusing on the ancient Hellenistic, Roman and Islamic period harbour of Myos Hormos.
What I found really interesting so far about this port is that a lot of the global but also regional modelling that has been done to predict future sea level rise won't necessarily affect Myos Hormos in the way they predict because of its unique coastal morphology. So it's got this crooked harbour, which is described in the ancient sources, and that's the feature which actually allowed us to identify and rediscover this harbour in the modern world, because it had the harbour mouth had silted up, so it didn't really look like it was a harbour anymore. But then via satellite image, you could see the siltation creating this pattern of a hook. So the harbour is protected from the Red Sea weather and storms because it's hooked into the land, which is obviously what made it an attractive place for a harbour in the ancient world. And then it's also got this huge coral reef barrier. So from a preliminary investigation of the site, and it's very, very preliminary, I've only just started doing this research, it seems that sea level rise won't actually affect this part of the Egyptian coast as the same rate as other parts of the Red Sea up to a certain parameter, and that actually ocean acidification and temperature rise in the ocean will be more important to the protection of the site, because it's that which will maintain or not maintain the health of the coral reef, which in turn protects the archaeology and also tourism around the site. So what all of this research shows so far is that much more nuance is needed when discussing potential climate change impacts on coast, and that maybe this 1.5 degrees C temperature rise that's seen as a benchmark won't affect Meals Hormuz so much, but will massively and irretrievably affect other areas.
So actually a big part of what my research is kind of about in terms of narratives and storytelling is the idea that perhaps the UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement and this kind of global dialogue on climate change is itself a very loaded narrative. It has its own particular story to tell about climate change as being one that is fundamentally global in scale. You know, starting with the climate science, which originally took localized observations and linked them up to create a picture of larger scale systems, but then in all sorts of other ways, politically, obviously, through these conferences, but also ethically, we have come to join up a lot of these ways of thinking about weather and climate into a sort of global scale, to the point where you have, you know, worldwide conversations about climate justice or environmental justice, and you have affected communities spanning, as you say, Greenland and the Marshall Islands, recognizing commonality in their shared precarity, and, you know, blocks of nations like AOSIS, as I mentioned before, all kind of recognizing things that they have in common. So it's a very joined up and globalist picture that you get of the climate crisis when you go to somewhere like COP, or when you sort of participate in any of these debates. And that is not that's not an apolitical framing, right? That, you know, it is ideologically a stance to take, to be thinking about issues in terms of global and globalized effects and causes. And so my reason for doing my research here is to think about what happens if there is not a kind of basic commitment to globalism as a worthwhile and good thing to pursue, and is it still possible to have a conversation about climate change in those circumstances, or are you necessarily at odds with that, you know, mainstream dialogue? And it comes down to where we just kind of were going there with finding alternative ways to talk about it that perhaps aren't bringing in this, as you know, I assume is a very partisan issue in the US of climate change and the climate change narrative. Can we find other ways to have conversations about localized sea level rise, and even mitigation, you know, how to decarbonize society? Can we do that in a way that isn't tapping into that logic of globalism, which is so second nature for so many of us involved in mainstream climate politics, but is not necessarily the right narrative for a lot of communities? And I'm finding, you know, that is the case for a lot of coastal areas in the US. So what I've been really looking at is how to hyper-localize these conversations about sea level rise, to frame it in a way that people will connect with on a very personal level, rather than, you know, drawing on these globalized science, globalized ethics, globalized, you know, notions of justice or whatever, which don't seem to really resonate so much with some people. But I just wanted to throw that in.
I just wanted to make a brief point building off Karl's research on the local and the global, because it just reminded me of something that came up when I was working in Seychelles, and I was looking at climate change impacts on, well, there was a lot of ecology research on the climate change impacts on reefs, and so I was working more with local fishers to understand how they perceived impacts. But it was really interesting that obviously global media is everywhere as well. So in people's stories about local impacts of climate change, they're obviously quite complex. Reefs are really complex systems. It's not just like stories of decline. But then if you ask people what caused like a myriad of different changes, a lot of the fishermen would say climate change. And I didn't have time to ask it in my interviews, but I really wanted to know what they interpreted by climate change, as opposed to what other communities might interpret about climate change, because some things they'd attribute to it that sort of weren't necessarily directly linked to climate change. They'd be linked to runoff or pollution or things like that. And then the other thing that I think was really stood out is that some of the fishermen commented about how much they enjoyed watching the Alaskan crab fishermen on TV. And I can't remember what program that is, but like extreme fishing, basically. And I thought there's nothing further away than fishing on the tropical seas of Seychelles versus an Alaskan fisherman, but they're all targeting fish or crustaceans. But it was just really interesting. I think it's a really interesting question about how these global narratives of climate change that we're all exposed to in our daily lives, how those interact with people's own experiences, and then how they interpret those experiences and then tell me about them as another external person. And there's so much confusion, I think, around what climate, not confusion, but just a lot of different meanings behind the term climate change in coastal areas. And I just think it's a really interesting question. And what would be really cool as well is see how in younger communities that's now coming through, because I think access to information and types of information has changed a lot. So yeah, maybe people, if you talk about climate change, then they think of graphs, or they think of dry scientists, or they think of skeptics or things like that. But actually all the examples that everyone's been talking about so far have been connecting to climate change in different ways. And so I wondered, Abby, if you could bring in that sort of point that you'd mentioned previously about that.
Yeah, so climate change is a bit weird for archaeology because it actually has like a lot of sort of short-term positives, but overall very much net negative. But then it's just really interesting that it can have a couple of random positives. So one of the examples I was reading about this week, in-depth research of specific sites hasn't really been done for the Mediterranean and MENA as much as it has been for Northern America and Europe. But there was a shipwreck, I can't remember where exactly, but off the coast of North America, and it was hit by a hurricane, I think. But then the hurricane and sort of like increased storminess and sea level rise in that area had actually ended up protecting the shipwreck because it was already a certain depth underwater. And then with like tidal changes and depositional changes, it ended up being covered in a layer of sediment, which then protected it. So that was just really interesting. But then, so what they're trying to do now is they send someone down there like every year to sort of assess how much sedimentation there is, what the ship looks like, what kind of state it's in, and then say whether it's being continued to be protected or not, which is really interesting. But then on the other hand, that is really rare to happen. Like that's just one example. Most of the time, bad things are happening. So with like sea level temperature increasing around the coast of Britain, different specific species of shipworms navigating northwards and sort of extending their reach, and then also extending their reach not just in the sea but also up estuaries and rivers, and then that then endangers specific kinds of maritime archaeology or shipwrecks around the coast.
I have to ask, what is a shipworm?
That's exactly what I wanted to know. What is a shipworm?
So they're actually, sometimes people get like marine biologists get really angry when you call them shipworms because they're not actually worms. They're a specific type of marine borer. So they're like, basically look like worms. Some of them look like severed fingers. They're quite grim, but they live in the ocean and in water, and they burrow into wood, which is why they like shipwrecks so much. And then once they're in the wood, you can't really see that they're there and then they just kind of lay dormant inside the wood, I think. And then they like hatch out of the wood and then sort of disintegrate the wood. But some of them also have calcium carbonate shells, which then is also interesting in terms of like ocean acidification and just generally their habitats and their lives being affected, but then in turn impacting on archaeology. Yeah, they're just kind of seen as a pest in archaeological terms.
So that story actually reminds me of a project Anna and I are collaborating on with a team of interdisciplinary grad students through a program at the National Socio-Environmental Synthesis Center in Maryland. And our idea was to identify social ecological narratives relating to human interactions with oysters in the US state of Maine. And these days, there's a lot going on there around aquaculture and an oyster bar renaissance of sorts, but we're also tracing those narratives back over 2,000 years to their roots, as evidenced in several oyster middens. Now, those are essentially large hills of oyster shells that Native Americans tossed onto scrap heaps over the course of a millennium. And it's been suggested that they may even have accumulated as a result of primitive entrepreneurial activities around drying and trading oysters. When European settlers arrived in the area in the 1600s, they were impressed not only by the enormity of the shell heaps, but also by the apparent absence of live oysters in the area. And in piecing together the story, we learned that long ago, the Gulf of Maine waters were too cold for oysters to establish viable populations. That is until melting glaciers caused sea levels to rise and created a warmer, higher saline, and essentially predator-free environment in which oysters flourished, until such time as they met their demise through a combination of harvesting by humans and further increases in sea level salinity and temperature, which, in addition to oysters, supported the growth of these small predatory snails known as oyster drills, which actually sound a lot like the oyster equivalent of Abby's shipworm. It's interesting to look back as we're confronting issues of anthropogenic climate change and to realize that there are parallels with shifts that altered species abundances and entire ways of life much earlier in human history.
So picking up on the idea of talking about climate change without necessarily saying that that's what you're doing, one of the groups that I spoke to when I was writing the National Historic Ships Climate Change Report was the Liner Community Interest Company. So they run a river barge, and they told me that they were intending to generate their own hot water at their marine hub by using hot tin pipes on their roof, and also maybe putting solar panels on the ship and on the roof of the hub. And maybe they were doing this precisely because of climate change, and that just wasn't really something that we talked about. But they also told me that this was a natural extension of being like a seafaring community, as when you're out at sea, particularly on a historic ship which doesn't have an engine, you're completely reliant on wind power. And so they were thinking, well, when we come back to the shore, we don't want to continue to be reliant on why don't we continue to be reliant on the natural world rather than using finite resources? So it just seems like a real extension for them to implement those systems. So that was really interesting. And also what was really interesting about the report as a whole was that there were so many different kinds of ships and ships companies that were doing really similar things. So it became a pattern that I could see. And a lot of them were caring about the natural environment by undertaking beach cleans, both coastally and in riverine areas. So Liner again undertakes these beach cleans along the River Tamar. And there's also another river barge called the Thalassa, which sails up the Thames, and they do exactly the same thing. So it just seems like they're not necessarily doing these things because of like hardcore climate activism, but because they care about the natural environment that they're in and have done for basically hundreds of years.
Yeah, I've also seen that stewardship ethos in a variety of contexts. The connections between people and the sea are quite generative. They also inspire art and literature, like the poem Giulia mentioned earlier, as well as innovation. And I think that's partly because on the ocean, invention is often a tool born from necessity. Actually, Jacques Cousteau once remarked in the context of ocean exploration, if you need something, you just make it. And an illustration of that comes to mind for me is from Joan Marshall's book, Tides of Change on Grand Manan Island, which chronicles an island fishing community through a tumultuous decade. In one anecdote, she describes how an islander designed a new type of fish feeding machine simply because the standard equipment was causing so much trouble for workers on the water. And his invention was ultimately taken up industry-wide. And that's just one example of how people with experience on the water tend to be tinkerers for whom proactive responses to a problem are often the norm rather than the exception. And that certainly also spills over into creative ideas about how to manage the marine commons and how to do so equitably and sustainably. So I wouldn't be surprised at all if key climate resilience innovations emerge from coastal communities. But circling back to indirect ways of speaking about climate change makes me think of the versatility of discussing the seaweed sector. So seaweed crops are unusual in many ways, one of which is that they absorb significant amounts of carbon and nitrogen without using freshwater arable land or fertilizer. So if, and this can be a big if, but if a seaweed farming venture is properly managed, it can create financial, environmental, and social value in tandem. And this underlying alignment makes it much easier to communicate its value with diverse stakeholders because each of those three aspects can be either emphasized or de-emphasized depending on the audience. In fact, this was definitely on display during the occasions seaweed was mentioned in relation to COP26. And if anyone is interested in learning a bit about the challenges and opportunities of the sector, the United Nations University just published a policy brief on the future of seaweed aquaculture. But of course, not every issue is that dynamic. Even still, though, and this gets to Karl's point about how important it is to actually listen to people with different perspectives. And I believe that finding just one small slice of a topic that resonates with someone, even if it's a very different slice of the topic than the one that resonates with you, but that can really help to build bridges that enable more difficult conversations down the road.
Another thing that I came across during my work with National Historic Ships was ocean literacy and sail training programs. And I think these are just incredibly important because it's so hard to care about something in the abstract sense. So if someone says to you, oh, we have to save the polar bears, but you've never seen a polar bear, it can be really hard to spur yourself into action. But when I was 16, I went on a sail training ship with the Ocean Youth Trust, which is a charity that introduces underprivileged, often inner city kids to the ocean. And whilst I was on this trip, and I talk about this a little in the Anthroposphere article I most recently wrote, which is called The Role of the Ocean, we saw dolphins and porpoise, and I don't know what kind of whale, but a really big one, and literally thousands of seals who'd wake us up really early in the morning when we were at anchor by all of their barking. And up until that point, I'd never really been like, yeah, whales are cool, because I'd never seen one. And I also didn't know that whales could live in the ocean near me. It just sort of seemed like they were a magical-esque creature that was either in captivity somewhere like SeaWorld and was very like sad, or was very far away from me. And I didn't know they could be in the North Sea near me. So just learning about that made me care about the ocean and want to research it more, which I guess is how I've ended up here. And then when I came to write the report for National Historic Ship, I ended up coming across another sail training and ocean literacy charity right at the other end of the UK. So the one I went on was in North Shields in Newcastle, but this one was in Exeter in Devon, and it's called the Island Trust Ocean Discoverability Programme. I spoke with a really lovely man there called John Hepburn, and he was saying exactly the same thing, that in order to make people care about the ocean, we have to introduce them to it. He also worked with underprivileged kids and also disabled kids on the historic ships the group owned, and he was saying that one of the things they find really amazing is when we go to a tide pool or for fishing, or when we go on the boat with the glass bottom and we just look at really weird sea creatures and they just think it's so cool. And then learning the name of those creatures gives people a kind of power and ownership over them, but not necessarily like a dodgy kind of ownership, but more of a custodianship or guardianship, which is so important. And the idea of custodianship is particularly interesting as anthropogenic climate change is usually framed as talking about the devastating impacts humans have had and will have on the natural world. But we can flip that on its head and say, well, if we can have such a negative impact, then surely we can also be the biggest positive actors on the planet.
So yeah, there are so many really interesting, I think, tension about two binaries that are present a lot in climate change discourse, which are on the one end, how we talk about climate change, whether we talk about it or not, how we narrate that. But also in terms of narration, and it's about who makes the narration, right? Who can tell the story. And that's one of the issues which with COP that we had as well in this discussion, who gets to tell the story, but also who gets to tell the story about specific communities. As we said at the introduction of this podcast, we're not aiming to talk on behalf of some communities, but I think this comes back to some of research we've all done in different ways about ideas of narration. And I think, Karl, you've looked a lot about ideas of the narrated versus the narrator, right?
Narrators in society versus the narrated. And I think this is probably something which occurs wherever there is marginality of any kind in the world. And especially kind of after the Trump era, I've been really interested in certain areas. And again, it's these typically sort of more white working class communities who get a lot of blame from a lot of the kind of more left-leaning climate community. And especially when the US kind of tumbled out of the Paris Agreement, they kind of lost their voice altogether. And there was a lot of discussion trying to explain what happened, trying to understand these communities, that kind of why don't they believe in science? Why don't they, it must be like a cultural thing, or it's a communication thing, or it's an education thing. And there was so much fascination to try and understand these people and why they don't understand climate change and all of that, and explain them from the outside in, and very little opportunity for them to kind of speak for themselves or any kind of curiosity about how people might rationalize their own lack of engagement or apathy towards the climate narratives. So this dichotomy between the narrators and the narrated, which often falls along class lines, but of course also is related to, in other contexts, race and between nations as well, and all sorts of different intersecting social issues.
Karl, you talked about the dichotomy between narrators and the narrators, and how communities are described from the outside, and that this represents some kind of asymmetrical power on how things are narrated politically. And I feel that as researchers and as practitioners, we need to stop thinking of them as a dichotomy. They're not different, they should be the same. And we have a responsibility to bring the narratives we're narrating alive on behalf of the people that we're researching or working with. I think in the UK, we're only just starting to respect this, whereas my Brazilian colleagues on the Fisher Voice project seem much further ahead. And similarly, you see that the narrators of stories have changed from sort of researchers to the people being researched across many countries, which have strong indigenous stories, such as Canada, the Inuits. But I find that, or I feel that our heritage in the UK is not very good at finding the flaw or the stories behind our people. We're not very good at giving the floor to our people. And maybe it goes back to a point before that maybe we're just disenchanted or disconnected from using our voice in a policy context, or we don't feel like we can make a change or a difference, or maybe we just don't think our stories are important. But I think in a management context or a policy context, we need to find a way of taking those stories to decision makers that they will listen, because we are the 12th longest coastline in the world, and we do have people living on that coastline who, like it or not, or even appreciate it themselves or not, are going to be impacted by climate change in very short timescales. I think this brings this together from what Karl was talking about, something that Giulia and I talked about before, way before this podcast. So the idea that a lot of these projects and narratives search a global description, and you're talking about wanting to readdress the local and the personal aspect. And then Abby brought in, and Anna, how to talk about climate change without talking about climate change, without highlighting the troubles and maybe, or the politics, but instead maybe on building resilience and learning from other communities or other stories and offering hope and opportunity for the future when having a climate change discussion. So Giulia told me something ages ago that shocked me, and maybe it's a good time to bring it in, or maybe Giulia will decide to cut it out. The idea that sci-fi is actually fiction that quite often is developed around ideas of forecasting the future and politics and change. And since then, reading almost everything I've read, I've picked it apart in a way I never have thought to before. But maybe Giulia will just talk about that if it's relevant. If she feels it's relevant, I feel like it does draw on a lot of the ways of presenting different stories, from science to real people's lives to just a seedling in their brain of the future.
Yes, I mean, I can quickly say something. I think what's fascinating about a genre like sci-fi, but also other ones in terms of literary studies, is that it's often seen maybe as popular fiction, but it has such a powerful impact in the way it can allow us to imagine the world in different ways. And I think what's really relevant in what you're talking about is that there seems to be this split between a type of narrative, which can be, sci-fi or Gothic, if you want to be really attached to literary genre nomenclature, which I think, we don't have to, but probably be whipped by all the literary studies community for saying that. But what they can really allow us to do is think about different ways to look at the world. And there seems to be the split between the idea that there's an apocalyptic view of the future, right? I mean, the cinema marketplace has been bombarded by apocalyptic movies about an anthropogenic climate crisis. I think, I don't want to spend too much time giving titles. You probably have ideas cropping up in mind as I say this. And often these narratives don't really focus on the crisis itself or the reasons for this crisis happening, but skip out to the post-apocalyptic world in which we just reinstall a very similar system to the one we've been living in, which is often at the core of the problem. While other narratives focus more on hope and the way we can be more hopeful in imagining new ways of living that are more sustainable, that bring into mind also a way to identify a legacy of issues that bring us to our current state. And what's really fascinating is that a few years ago, the notion of climate fiction came out, and this idea that some fiction is focused specifically on climate crisis. But my work has been mostly on literatures from across the American continent, especially the Caribbean and South Latin America. And it's quite interesting to think that a lot of these narratives have always been climate fictions in many ways. They've always had a different relation to their environment and their space. And they've been thinking about the impact of anthropology and climate change. And here I'm thinking of a novel by an Asian author called Jacques Roumain. And he published in 1947 a novel which in English, the title is translated to Masters of the Dew. The original French title is Gouverneur de la Rosée, a title which is itself based on a Haitian expression, refers to people who are in charge of irrigating the land, watering the land, in particular agricultural fields for subsistence. And the whole novel looks at how, in quite apocalyptic terms, the land has been eroded by monocrop agriculture throughout the colonization of Haiti by France and the subsequent American occupation of Haiti. And so that's 1947, and climate fiction as a term has come out maybe 5-10 years ago, right? So we can go back as far as the early 1900s or before to see how a lot of that literature or visual arts or different forms of poetry have been thinking about these issues already, because anthropogenic climate change has already been happening there for a long time. Another project I wanted to also share here, because I think it's relevant, it's maybe slightly less related to sci-fi, but to this other genre or irrealist genre as they're called sometimes, so more with the gothic and the horror, for example. There's a network that was created by 3 academics, Dr. Emily Alder, based at Edinburgh and Napier University, Dr. Joan Passy, based at Bristol University, and Dr. Jimmy Packham at University of Birmingham. And the whole network sort of focus is grounded on investigations of coastal and littoral spaces through horror Gothic media, including literature, cinema, poetry, music, etc. And in March 2021, they had launched the network through a conference. The conference title was Haunted Shores, just like the network name is. There's going to be another conference in next year in May 2022 on seaweed. So the network has been growing that way. They're also running a reading group, and Lauren Nixon and myself were hired as research fellow on that network for over the summer just to help develop it. And the research is just really exciting, and it's really spanning very broadly. Dr. Emily Alder works in particular also on Scottish coasts, and she's received funding by the Royal Society of Edinburgh to develop a bit specifically on haunted Scottish shores. So there'll be more on that in the future, which is really exciting. But you can also listen to Joan Passy's and Jimmy Packham's work. I think they've shared it in different podcasts. Joan was on the BBC Thinkers talking about Cornish haunted shores, and also Dr. Jimmy Packham in a video on YouTube, which is part of a art matter series by the University of Birmingham, describes also this idea that Britain coasts have often been depicted as haunted throughout British literature because it's a space obviously of danger and contact, but also and therefore makes you deal with ideas of belonging and sovereignty, which are revived in the time of Brexit and COVID. Building on these ideas, I'm very interested in how hauntings and spectrality play a crucial role in when we think about climate emergency and coastal communities, not only because, as we've discussed so far, how coastal communities are on the front line of change, of anthropogenic climate change, and they've been there for a long time, but also I think if we think about very specific example of haunting, so there could be, on the one hand, there's this idea of haunting as future haunting, by future extinction that is not that far future and is undertaking. But there's another type of haunting I'm quite interested in as well, which is, I think sometimes of the whole issue of second homes in in places in the UK and thinking about Joan Spassy's work in Cornwall, there's also hunting can be a very interesting metaphor or trope here to think about these towns in Cornwall which just become empty once tourists are gone, and so they become haunted in some matters. And there was a recent, a couple of months ago, article on The Guardian saying how some coastal communities or coastal towns in the UK are amongst the less happy and healthy ones, and they're not often present or in the mind of policymakers when it comes of thinking about different social aid and support. And so I think there's another type of hunting there as well that has several layers. So I think fictions in general and all the different kind of tropes and imagery we can use really allow us to articulate sometimes issues in terms of climate change, anthropogenic or not. I think it relates also to what you were talking about, Karl and Anna, but also Abby and Liz, this idea that how do we talk about climate change? Is there different ways to talk about it in a way that doesn't say climate change is not about graphs and scientists, but something we can tackle and that can allow us also to mourn in different ways, right? If we think back to when you mentioned Simone Howe and Dominique Boyer about Funeral for Glaciers, this idea of mourning, what a funeral can offer us as a way of mourning bits of our environment that we're losing through climate change. So yeah, I think this is where different disciplines come in such an interesting way to allow us to see how we can engage with climate change, talk about climate change, but also learn about climate change not only from academia and text, whether fictional or scholarly, but learning about climate change from other communities who are living through that. So whether by interviewing them, as some of you have done, or by reading their literature, which is another way to negotiate and mediate this impact.
I find Orford Ness in Suffolk in the UK really interesting to think about in terms of haunted coastlines, as it was a subject of a book I read earlier this year called Ness by Robin McFarlane and Stanley Donwood. And it's described as part novella, it's really short, and part prose poetry. And it's also got loads of illustrations, which I think were by Stanley Donwood. So the blurb of the book describes how somewhere on a salt and shingle island inside a ruined concrete structure known as the Green Chapel, a figure called the Armourer is leading a ritual with terrible intent, but something is coming to stop him, and describes how creatures will converge to become Ness, who is made of tidal drift, green moss, and deep thyme, and has hagstones for eyes and speaks only in birds. So it's this sort of like very magical, I don't quite know how to describe it, but this is a certain style that's becoming like quite popular at the moment, and I really enjoy it. And as I was reading this book, I felt that the eerie salt and shingle coastline described here sounded really familiar, which is when I realised it was about the site of Orford Ness, which was also written about in one of my favourite non-fiction books, which is Caitlin de Silvy's Curated Decay, Heritage Beyond Saving. So the site of Orford Ness in particular really comes into the idea of haunting and haunted coastlines, as so much of it is now in curated ruination, combining the dynamism of coastlines with new forms of plant and animal life, woven, literally in some cases, through the human structures on the site. And as Orford Ness was formerly administered by the Ministry of Defence, who conducted military tests there during the Cold War and established an atomic weapons research establishment there, this coastal site is particularly eerie, even more so now that it's part of this curated decay experiment, which may become more prevalent as climate change continues to affect heritage in the UK.
I wanted to jump in here too, actually, and maybe follow up on something that Giulia mentioned around the narratives in AT. And Giulia, as you were talking about, those stories from, I think it was 1947, around the repercussions of monoculture on the land and, people thinking about how that might play forward in a, fiction sense, but obviously we have a lot to learn from what we call fiction around our aspirations and ideals and fears for the future and the ideas that people are haunted by. And I just think that, I guess one of the things that I think about often in the aquaculture space is really, it's already providing more than well over 50% of our seafood globally. Yet it is such a young industry in terms of, human history of domestication of species. And there is so much potential for it to grow. And so I try to think around, okay, what can we learn from the industries that have come before us? What can we learn from the successes and mistakes of others, of agriculture, of wild capture fisheries? And, one of the ideas, I've been working on a project for a little while, kind of bouncing around concepts from the biomimicry literature and looking at nature-inspired approaches to polyculture and trying to think about other ways that we might be able to do things that help us to have a more sustainable more sustainable outcomes in the future. And I just think that, we've talked some during these conversations around some of the lost opportunities for learning. And I think that it would be great if we all move forward as a society, seizing those opportunities rather than continually reflecting on how we might be losing them.
I think, Holly, your idea of offering hope and really thinking about this new sector that is the aquaculture sector makes me really think back on the commercialization of our shores over time. So that's something that I've been working on for quite a number of years now. And my interest sprung from foraging, like people foraging the shore and wild produce, which has been in the press a huge amount the last few years. People actually taking up foraging in their spare time, but also people commercializing it. And again, similarly, I've got the same kind of concerns, because historically, I think in terms of the global context, you see seashore foraging was very much something that made us human in the first place. People started foraging, and then as industrialization came, it was often the women and the children and the elderly who would be doing that. In fact, I was reading my 6-year-old a book yesterday, Little Nuts Escape, and it was actually all about that, and how the children and the grandpa were sent out foraging while the more fit and able were out hunting. But then over time, as wild stocks have been commercialized, with industrialization has come sort of male dominance. And I think it's really interesting play and how those things have changed. And quite often the women and children have been pushed out. But yeah, those activities have been marginalized and always thought as not important. But in fact, when you're looking at developing new industries, I think you can say there's a lot to be learned from those things. And also inherently as humans, we like to return to those things quite often. I think if you look at the psychological theories of biophilia theory, as humans, some people find that there's a subconscious sort of need to be around provisioning habitats, those that have given us something historically in an evolutionary term, be it water or food sources. And I just think it's really important to reflect on what we can learn rather than dwelling on what we have done, so to speak.
But I suppose when thinking about stories of change in coastal spaces, I think what I wanted to say was how change is actually the norm in a lot of coastal spaces. And that builds off a lot of what Liz and Holly have already been talking about in terms of learning from other people's experiences. And so I think a lot of my work, I've been rethinking what change is. And actually, if change is the norm, then how do we start maybe asking questions about future change? Because there is a form of change that is damaging. And we have talked about change of like a physical loss of space, of cultures and things like that. But actually being resilient to change can also be a sense or a source of pride and identity, and sort of like how people choose to adapt to change is also a big part of like them affirming their identities within coastal spaces. So I think there's some really interesting questions there around change, when actually, if change is the default, how do we talk about future change? Is it about thresholds, or is it about the nature of change, or is it the speed of change? And that change is also felt unequally, experienced unequally. And so I think that was my sort of two penny. It's not really something I have answered, but it's something about how I think I've approached change has moved over time.
Change and how some communities just deal with change. It's part of their coastal environment, and they embrace it sometimes, or they adapt to it. And I think this is really important question of what we do with our narratives and how we help to use those stories to build resilience and transfer those skills to communities that haven't had to deal with change, that have been more stagnant over time, and have become more staid or unable to cope with change, I guess. I watched a really interesting podcast recently, or a lecture it was, by an ethnographer, and he was talking about his research with Inuits, who have actually been having to adapt to climate change for the last 100 years or more. They, in their very lifestyle, change all the time. They move to adapt to change, and they find ways to adapt to change. And there are so many stories that we can learn from them, but it's very difficult to find the best way to tell them, to make a change, to make other people identify with them, and realize how we can build resilience amongst our own cultures. And that's a really big challenge of the storytellers, us as researchers and policymakers. And I think as academics who work with the public and with a lot of these communities, we're in a really privileged position where we can really empower our stakeholders by telling their stories to make a difference, not only to them, but also to the way that other academics work, the way that stakeholders around the world, or coastal communities around the world, engage with climate change and adapt, but also to the policymakers ourselves. So I feel like it's almost part of our job description to be honest and true to those people that we represent.
I couldn't agree more, Liz, about our responsibilities as researchers. I also wanted to follow up on your and Anna's points about how admirably coastal communities have embraced and are continuing to adapt to a changing climate. And I wonder if that capacity is in part a natural extension of being so attuned to the environment on a daily and even on a moment-to-moment basis. Although many of us check the weather when we're deciding about bringing an umbrella, we tend to largely be unaware of or disconnected from the subtler signals of nature. Whereas people who live on the coast and work on the water are constantly at the whims of the sea. And that makes for a noticeably different perspective on time and priorities. And initially, actually, I found that frustrating as a researcher when I was trying to schedule interviews for a specific time and, was sometimes met with, well, probably, but it depends on the wind, it depends on the tide. And over time, though, that's something that I've actually really come to embrace and love about fieldwork. I've learned, okay, part of my job is to be perpetually flexible with plans, to put my expectations aside, and to be ready to meet each moment as it comes. And for me, that's quite different from my day-to-day life in Montreal. But for people who live on the coast, that's just normal. That's how life is. Not all of the time by any stretch, but proximity to the sea seems to correlate with a background awareness and acceptance that on any given day, plans may be adjusted due to circumstances beyond human control. And I think that's another dimension where globalized society perhaps can take a cue from coastal communities, because we're living in an era where all of us need to recognize that change is happening at both macro and micro scales. And we need to come to terms with uncertainty and pay attention to the world around us and learn to adapt and to really rise to the occasion in response to environmental challenges. A different theme from our conversations that really struck me is the one of perspective. An example that comes to mind is the 30 by 30 initiative to conserve 30% of the world's oceans by 2030. And I've attended other events this year that also highlighted it as ambitious and important and a critical solution, not only for fisheries and biodiversity, but also for the climate. And 30 by 30 absolutely is all of those things. Yet it's important for us to keep in mind how essential it is to ensure that so-called blueprints or silver bullet solutions are appropriately tailored to fit local conditions, and especially that the people they will impact are able to participate meaningfully in their design and implementation. And that's not to say that won't be the case with 30 by 30, by many accounts high on the priority list. However, it was interesting for me to see the juxtaposition in the commentary around COP between enthusiasm about 30 by 30 and some Indigenous representatives describing it as one of the biggest planetary land and ocean grabs they could imagine. So I was actually wondering, Anna, if you have any thoughts on that, given your experiences navigating competing interests in your own work.
That it's complicated. Yeah, I think I've worked in the fisheries and marine protected area space simultaneously, and it is very challenging sometimes. I think for me, what mostly comes out is processes of co-management, processes of engaging with different views and understanding benefits and impacts. And so traditionally protected areas, I don't think have been very good at that. As you say, it's an ocean or land grab. It can be quite exclusionary. It can be very alienating, of like a occupying people's space, basically, in a different way. But there is a need to set aside, areas to recover and things like that. And that is that fits within what so-called traditional management practices. They are just, I find traditional is a little bit like belittling sometimes, but it's what I mean is sort of, it's kind of like the tree narrative at the moment of replanting millions of trees. It's like, there are bad places to plant trees as well, so it's like right place, right time when it comes to protected area discussions and debates. But I think it's much more around conversations, as I say, of like co-management and understanding different views. It's something that the UK government is navigating at the moment when it comes to fisheries, and I think it'll be really interesting to see how that evolves in a sort of post-Brexit world, for example, where these policy crises sort of happen and big things change, and then there's opportunities there to evolve.
So thank you, all of you. Thank you, Abby. Thank you, Anna. Thank you, Holly. Thank you, Liz. And thank you, Karl, for just sharing your insights with me and humoring me when inviting you to discuss all together. I feel like I've learned a lot, and I hope this will be an interesting conversation for people to listen to as well. I'm very grateful for that. And in the spirit of our discussion, I'll let Karl's soulful pronunciation of the end close the podcast.
The end.